We're going to talk today about Candide, the poor boy who goes from having nothing to being able to give ropes of pearls and diamonds to his beloved Cunegonde. He has the most extreme torture, the most extreme emotions. It's wonderful. And it's Leonard Bernstein. You're going to love it. Everything happens for the best in this best of all possible worlds. It's the only thing you may remember from your college days when you studied Candide. I'm sure that Mireille and Jean-Pierre probably memorized it. I might turn the class over to you at some point. This is really a three-pronged class. The first part is about Voltaire, the second will be Bernstein, and the final will be the most charming production of Candide you have ever seen in your life. I have to admit that I went to see Candide, the New York City Opera did it about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe more, and I walked out. I can't ever remember walking out on an opera before. But I walked out. It just seemed like a bunch of noise, and I'm sure some of you are fans of Jesus Christ Superstar, but I walked out on that too. And it was just too much noise and too many people on stage, and you couldn't keep track of anything. This is totally different. I don't know how Palm Beach Opera's production will be. I'm sure it will be good and likable, because they always are very good and very likable. So just having said that, I now love Candide. This is a darling production. It's a production with Kristen Chenoweth, who amazes me by singing. She is the best at singing that famous aria, and I put her against Nathalie Dessay, Patricia Pettibon, and even Beverly Sills. I didn't see Beverly Sills do it, so it was undoubtedly wonderful. She's fabulous, so it's worth staying, even if you don't like the rest of the class. Stay to hear her sing that. The beginning of Candide is something that we all need to know more about. I'm just going to stand up so I can see what Gordon puts up at the time he puts it up, because there has been criticism that I don't keep up with what Gordon's putting up. The criticism came from Gordon.
Oh.
Gordon. So, we're going to be talking about philosophy, and how many of you know a philosopher? Really?
Today?
Who?
Oh, you mean today? Or?
Yes.
Oh.
No.
Oh, no, I mean today. It's not something popular today, is
No.
it? It's not something we talk about. Once people had enough to eat, some people, and they had corrected sort of the world, they had buildings, and they could afford to live, they turned their mind to why are we living? Why was I born? What am I giving? But we think about that. And of course we know that today religion is Mammon more than anything else, the god of the golden god. But when they were starting in the beginning of the 17th century and the 18th century is called the age of philosophy, it was very important. They had people arguing philosophy. They had the printing press, so they could print their opinions and it could be seen. The beginning actually was in England, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. And then it continued to France. And we'll start with Rousseau, because he and Voltaire were considered the two great philosophers of the 18th century. They began in the beginning of that century, say around 1715, they began writing. Candide was written, I believe, 1759, and it was the beginning of the age of revolutions, and indeed it contributed to the revolutions. Rousseau's philosophy was more the nature of man. Rousseau corresponded with Catherine the Great. He corresponded with the rulers at that time, because even the rulers, or the good ones, were trying to figure. I don't know that Louis XV, who was king in France at that time, was working on being a good king. But other people were very concerned with how does one live? What are the rules? We have rules listed in the Old Testament. We have rules listed in the Ten Commandments. They're not a bad rule to follow. But they were searching for answers, and they were searching for science. Descartes was a scientist as well as a great philosopher, the Cartesian thought. And the one that is important to us before we get to Voltaire is Leibniz. Leibniz is not one that the average man on the street has heard about, but he is responsible, they say, for us having computers, even back then,
Really?
because he was investigating. Mathematics was considered to be part of daily life, and I know nothing about mathematics, and I can't say I have a great desire to learn. But it's he began the idea that numbers, everything, he felt that everything could be reduced to numbers. What I like about Leibniz is that he was an optimist. He was the one who saw the cup half full, always saw the cup half full, which irritated Voltaire. Some of the others of that period whom you may know is Baruch Spinoza. He had the idea that we are inventing our lives. And I think that that's great fun. My personal answer to why we are here and why God has put us on earth is that he needed amusement. If we always had free will, right? Because if we always did what God wanted us to do, then he would have no amusement at all. So think about how much amusement you have actually afforded God, and he will reward you for that. Isaac Newton was another mathematician. We all know the story of Isaac Newton and the apple falling from the tree. I think every school child remembers that. The next one is a modern philosopher. And this is my latest, what I call a cougar crush. I keep falling in love with these dashing young men like Rolando Villazón and Jonas Kaufmann. Usually they're singers, but this one is a philosopher, and I cannot recommend him highly enough to you. Apparently he's very famous in England. He was born from a billionaire Jewish family in Switzerland, was educated at the best schools in England, which I guess is Oxford, and where took many degrees. He happens, is this the picture I like? Yes. Just look at that. Yeah. He speaks so beautifully. He has this wonderful part English, part Swiss accent. He pronounces all the names correctly. And he has adapted philosophy to modern times. There are probably 100. It's called The School of Life on YouTube, and it's well worth looking. He does long speeches which take an hour. Personally, I sleep with him every night. Because if you can't sleep, I know that Chrissy, who's not here, but Chrissy and I share that we go to sleep with recorded books. She listens to mystery stories. She never knows how they came out. I listen to Alain de Botton. You'll see one of his little clips with cartoon things. It's talking about Voltaire and explaining Voltaire a little bit later, and you'll hear his voice. Anyway, I just so highly recommend that you tune in on YouTube and listen to something. They have clips anywhere from 6 minutes to an hour and a half. And he talks about modern romance, why we always marry the wrong person. Why we go to museums and look at art in the wrong order. All kinds of really, really, I find very interesting things. And as you know, I'm easily bored. So now we get to Voltaire. He had himself a hard road to hoe because he disagreed with the monarchy. He disagreed with organized religion. He disagreed with all the things that were ruling the world at that time. If you can imagine the world, when you go to see Candide, it's important that you bear in mind the fact that life was not, I mean, we today think it's outrageous that when somebody's head is cut off. That's the least of the things that they did to people in those days. And this isn't even the Inquisition I'm talking about. If they arrested you, they could cut off your hand, cut off your legs, whatever. And they had torture chambers, and it was a part of everyday life. Starvation was also a part of everyday life. The aristocrats, there were three classes. You remember the fourth estate, which we all know is the media, who now rules the world, but maybe not anymore since there's Twitter. But the three estates were the aristocrats, and they lived very well. And if you were incarnated as an aristocrat, the world was fine. Then there were the clergy. Everything went well. If you were a member of the clergy, you lived very well, you ate very well, you drank very well. And some of them even enjoyed romance on the side, as we will see in Candide. If you were born a peasant, your life was really very hard. Voltaire thought that was wrong. He thought that there should be welfare. He thought that life was really very difficult. And this is where he differed with Leibniz. And part of Candide is because he felt that the glass was half empty, or maybe 3/4 empty. And that was the writings of Voltaire were many. Candide has survived, and everyone studies Candide. But he wrote so many things that were important. And we have a short clip about Voltaire.
François-Marie Arouet was born in Paris in 1694. His father, a well-established lawyer, sent him to the best school in the capital, and by all accounts he was a brilliant student. The young Arouet decided at an early age to make his name as a writer, or rather to remake his name, as the first thing he did was to change this name to Voltaire. The 18th century is often referred to as the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment, but sometimes more fairly simply as the Age of Voltaire. So changing his name was a good call. The Age of Arouet would just not have worked quite as well. Voltaire was precociously talented as a poet. At the age of only 24, he had his first verse tragedy performed at the Comédie Française. By then, he'd already begun work on an epic poem about the French religious civil wars of the 16th century, glorifying Henry IV as the king who brought peace by pragmatically converting from Protestantism to Catholicism. This was to be a subject dear to Voltaire's heart, for under the guise of writing a national epic, he was dwelling at length on the bloody consequences of religious intolerance. Right from the start, Voltaire's views on religion were expressed robustly. He was not an atheist, in part because he thought that some minimal belief in a deity was useful for social cohesion. Voltaire's God had created the world, instilled in us a sense of good and evil, and then basically taken a back seat. This was known as rational religion, or in the 18th century called natural religion or deism, and it had no truck with metaphysics of any kind. Voltaire was basically a man of reason who loathed fanaticism, idolatry, and superstition. That men can kill each other to defend some bit of religious doctrine which they scarcely understand is something he found repellent, and he reserved his greatest hatred for the clerics who exploited the credulity of believers to maintain their own power base. Voltaire wanted religion, but not the church. For obvious reasons, the Catholic authorities were not keen for Voltaire's poem about Henry IV, La Henriade, to be published in France. So Voltaire decided to go and publish it in London instead, and in 1726 went and travelled to England. What began as a business trip soon turned, however, into something quite different, and Voltaire ended up staying in England for some 2.5 years. He learnt to speak English fluently, got to know writers and politicians, and became a great admirer of English Protestant culture. He decided to write a book about his experience of England, and the Letters Concerning the English Nation appeared first in English in 1733. The French authorities were horrified. The book was censored, and Voltaire only narrowly avoided prison. That's because the book presented an informal portrait of English culture in a witty and ironical style, looking in turn at religion, politics, science, and literature, in ways that were critical, implicitly, of French culture and politics. Here, for example, is how Voltaire presents the Royal Exchange, a handsome building in the heart of the city of London where merchants from across the world would meet to transact business. "Take a view of the Royal Exchange," Voltaire wrote, "where the representatives of all nations meet for the benefit of mankind. There the Jew, the Mahometan, and the Christian transact together as though they all profess the same religion and give the name of infidel to none but bankrupts. There the Presbyterian confides in the Anabaptist, and the Churchman depends on the Quaker's word. At the breaking up of this pacific and free assembly, some will withdraw to the synagogue, and others to take a glass. This man goes and is baptized in a great tub in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. That man has his son's foreskin cut off, while a set of Hebrew words, quite unintelligible to him, are mumbled over his child. If one religion only were allowed in England, the government would very possibly become arbitrary. If there were but two, the people would cut one another's throats. But as there are such a multitude, they all live happy and in peace." Voltaire's message is clear. Religious differences are trivial and separate men, while trade is important and brings them together. His conclusion that the plurality of religions in England leads to a more peaceful society is, of course, a covert criticism of France, where the Catholic Church was so dominant. The letters concerning the English nation also discuss Locke and Newton, thinkers then poorly known in France. The subject matter might seem challenging, but Voltaire is a past master at popularizing difficult material. Ask any school child today what they know about Newton, and they'll tell you about the apple falling on his head, and the survival of this anecdote is due entirely to Voltaire. He heard it from Newton's niece, and immediately understood that this simple, homely image was the perfect way of conveying the simplicity of Newton's explanation of the force of gravity. After Voltaire used the story in his letters concerning the English nation, everyone remembered it, and Voltaire left his mark on English popular culture. Voltaire struggled with the question of good and evil, the problem at the heart of his best-known work, Candide, which was published in 1759 and was a bestseller from the moment it appeared. Translated into every possible language, it remains the most widely read work of the European Enlightenment. It's even left its mark on our language. Expressions like pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others, or il faut cultiver le jardin, we must cultivate our garden, have entered common usage. In the best of all possible worlds, yes, that's another one, speakers of French or English quote Candide without even realizing it, and that's the sure mark of a classic. Candide is a timeless work, a satire of the human condition, but it's also a work of the Enlightenment, and its philosophical theme is announced in the title, Candide or Optimism. The hero of Candide, as his name tells us, is an innocent anti-hero. He is enthralled to his tutor, Pangloss, who preaches the philosophy of optimism. This is not optimism in the modern sense of looking on the bright side. Optimism, spelt with a capital O, and as expounded by the German philosopher Leibniz, was an attempt to answer the age-old problem of evil. Why, if God is good, does he permit the existence of evil in the world? To which the 18th century Leibnizian optimist replies, evil is all part of some greater pattern of good. All partial evil, universal good, as the English poet Pope put it. In other words, evil doesn't really exist at all. It's just something which man imagines because of his limited view of the world. You might think this sounds like a bit of a confidence trick, and Voltaire certainly did. But this idea did find widespread acceptance in the 18th century. Candide's great mission was to put this philosophy to the test. Ejected from his comfortable home in an obscure German castle after trying to seduce the baron's beautiful daughter Cunégonde, Voltaire's hero Candide undergoes many trials and tribulations. Conscripted into the army, he fights in a war, then deserts, only to find himself a witness to an earthquake in Lisbon. Candide is repeatedly brought face to face with evil in its most extreme forms. Moral evil in the case of the earthquake, where man is not apparently to blame, and most of all, human evil, such as a war where man is very definitely to blame. Pangloss's breezy optimism is clearly an inadequate response to enormities of evil on this scale. Eventually, even Candide comes to realize this. To quote from the book, and sometimes Pangloss would say to Candide, all events form a chain in the best of all possible worlds, for in the end, if you'd not been given a good kick up the backside and chased out of a beautiful castle for loving Miss Cunégonde, and if you hadn't been subjected to the Inquisition, and if you hadn't wandered about America on foot, and if you hadn't dealt the Baron a good blow with your sword, and if you hadn't lost all your sheep from that fine country of El Dorado, you wouldn't be here now eating candied citron and pistachio nuts. That is well put, replied Candide, but we must cultivate our garden. After 1760, Voltaire took up residence in the chateau at Ferney, just outside Geneva. By now, he was the most famous living writer in Europe, and he became widely known as the patriarch of Ferney. He took up a number of public causes. In 1761, a Protestant merchant, Jean Calas, was accused of murdering his son and sentenced by the judges of Toulouse to be tortured and then broken on the wheel. The legal processes were, to say the least, irregular, and the suspicion grew that the judges in this Catholic city had acted with excessive zeal out of religious bigotry. Voltaire became involved in the case and mounted an energetic campaign to rehabilitate Calas's memory and help the members of his family who'd been left destitute. He wrote letters to those in authority and published a stream of pamphlets, culminating in 1763 in his Traité sur la tolérance, which begins with the historical facts of the Calas case and broadens out into a history of religious intolerance in European culture. Voltaire's writings had enormous impact on public opinion, and eventually the judges in Paris quashed the judgment of the Toulouse court. Too late to save Calas, but a huge victory for Voltaire, who'd learnt an important lesson about how change could be brought about through the pressure of public opinion. Opinion rules the world, he wrote in 1764, but in the long run, it's the philosophers who shape this opinion. Voltaire said of himself that he wrote to act, and he wanted his writings to change the way people thought and behaved. In leading his crusades against fanaticism, he even invented a campaign slogan, Écraser l'infâme, which translates roughly as crush the despicable. L'infâme stands here for everything that Voltaire hated, everything that he had spent his life fighting, superstition, intolerance, irrational behaviour of every kind. We should never forget that Voltaire was also a brilliant writer, one of the greatest stylists the French language has ever known. The power of his ideas had a lot to do with the power of his expression. Many writers made fun of miracles. No one did so as hilariously as Voltaire. Always Voltaire had an ear for the telling phrase, "If God had not existed, it would have been necessary to invent him." It's a good line, even in English, and better still in the original French, where it's more memorable because it's a classical Alexandrine line in 12 syllables. Si Dieu n'existait pas, il faudrait l'inventer. Voltaire's legacy in our present debates about religious toleration remain extremely potent. Hardly a week passes without an article in the press quoting, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." This rallying cry of tolerant multiculturalism is so potent that if Voltaire hadn't said it, we would have had to invent it. Which is what happened. The expression was invented by an Englishwoman in 1906. No matter, it expresses a truth which is fundamentally important to our culture, so we have adopted the phrase and decided that Voltaire said it. Voltaire's name has become synonymous with a set of liberal values: freedom of speech, rejection of bigotry and superstition, belief in reason and tolerance. It's a unique and nowadays extremely precious legacy.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
He makes it just fascinating. I mean, we don't need cartoons, but it keeps you, I don't know, it was a long clip, but I thought he told it much better than I could, and it illustrated it much, it kept your attention, and it's something that it's important for us all to keep in mind, especially, I mean, if you think that was written, 400 years ago, and I think it's just as true today as it was then. But of course, the church had all the power in the world at that time, and the king and the aristocracy as well, so he was really fighting an upstream battle. He could be considered the first of the liberals, and that brings us in a roundabout way, bad segue, to Leonard Bernstein, who was so many things that he never quite became the thing he wanted to be. This is a beautiful book about Bernstein, and I want you to just look at the pictures while you're listening so closely to what I say, and I'll pass it around. He was about the most extraordinary total conductor, certainly, who ever lived, and he was a conductor, he was a composer, he was a teacher. Did any of you go to the lecture on Leonard Bernstein last week? He reached his peak during the end of the last 20th century, and I think that in a way that was his curse, because he had too many talents. He could write, he could speak, he was good-looking, he was sociable, he loved society. He was a terribly passionate man. He insisted on kissing everybody on the lips, and he would hold your face so you couldn't avoid it. Everybody, man, woman, child, dog, whatever. He was notorious for liking men, but he loved women too. He loved everybody. He was just larger than life in every way. He never achieved the respect as a classical composer that he wanted, and some people say, oh, he was a tragic figure. He wasn't a tragic figure. He had a wonderful time. If you ever saw him or met him, I mean, he was always the wildest, most charming person at the party. He was always the one that he would sit down at the piano and play anything. Mary Had a Little Lamb and make it sound like it was Beethoven. He was just an extraordinary character who lit up the world during 50 years. He was friendly with most of society in New York. Now, composing is a lonely life. It's a solitary life. You have to lock yourself in your room like Beethoven, and some people Mozart got up in the middle of the night and couldn't write enough. I mean, he only lived such a short time, but he wrote more than anyone. It's something you have to devote yourself to, and Bernstein was too fond of society. He was too fond of conducting and teaching. Did any of you remember seeing the lectures that he gave on television, the early days of television? He was a fascinating man. He could make the child fascinated with music. He wrote books on music. So he was too versatile in a way. And he always said, oh, poor me, me poveretto. I wish that I could go down in history like Mozart or Wagner. But the truth was, he lived the life that he loved to live. He was an exuberant conductor, and that seems strange because one thinks that the Vienna Philharmonic and the Viennese are very conservative. Claudia, where are you? She can bear that out, that the Viennese like things the way they were because they're pretty good. But they adored Leonard Bernstein. And as a rule, they didn't like wild, pretentious people, but they adored Leonard Bernstein. They would have done anything for him. And if they didn't like a conductor, they would play badly. Really, they would. And for Bernstein, they would do anything. Watching him conduct is a tremendous experience in itself. And so there are many clips of him conducting on television, but I thought it would be good for you to see the clips that I've put out. Here he's rehearsing the BBC orchestra. And it's just a 2-minute clip, but it's worth watching.
Okay, now that you've all suffered through that, and now that you know the truth about... I'm serious. Did you ask about serious? Oh, am I serious? You should hear it.
It just feels impossible.
It's not. It's not. Now let's go from 50, please. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Now, what? It's heaven. Now do it with the tuba. 3, 4. You can do more. You can do more. Give it all you got. They're giving all they got. Come on. Here you go. 3, and. You talk big, but you don't last. You know what I mean? All right. Now let me hear some other folks at 51. Like violins. Never mind your oi. Sit up, be a captain. Take a breath. Lead your troops. 3, 4. It's fabulous. Really? That's the way that dog was.
I was thinking when I was listening to the conductor with the Elixir of Love that in the overture he was so clear. Every instrument, you could hear every instrument was very clear. And you don't think about it when you go to an orchestral concert or any concert, you don't realize that how important every note is, even the triangle. So.
We have a new member of the orchestra. Luigi is playing. So we have 2 triangles. Now, let me hear taking it up from 2 triangles. 1. No, it has to be taking it up. The same rhythm that they've been playing. Everybody plays so well. Taking it up. 1. It's better. It's a little better. should really be 15 triangles going, taking it up, but we can't do that. We're lucky to have 2. Can you make it somehow more rhythmic so it's not just a clink? So it's taking it up, I don't know where, but play higher on the triangle. Taking it up. I'm not a triangle specialist. 1. No, it sounds like the doorbell. I mean, it just could be anything. Just, taking it up. I don't know how to tell you to do it, but do it. 1. Yeah, it's worse. It's worse. Well, congratulations.
I don't know if any of you remember George Plimpton.
Yes.
And he played with the Detroit Lions or something, and then he wanted to play with the New York Philharmonic, and he played the triangle. And he said it was the most nerve-wracking. It was much more nerve-wracking than having all those fullbacks coming at him on the football field. He had to sit there, and everybody's waiting for him to. If you're wrong, yeah, it's so funny. This is a piece that Bernstein, a serious piece that Bernstein conducted. He was friendly with the Kennedys and all those people, and Jacqueline Kennedy commissioned him to write this mass after Robert Kennedy died. This is just a trailer, so you hear some excerpts of Bernstein writing classical music.
Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to men of goodwill.
Bernstein's not intimidated by anything. That's not part of his vocabulary, intimidation.
He tried to take all the elements of his life, his love for pop and rock music, his love for theater and dance and motion. It was an extraordinary attempt to create another art form.
Sing God a simple song, loud day. Make it up as you go along, loud day.
In my mind, Mass is one of the most important, if not the most important score you wrote, because for the first time it brought together these halves of his musical personality and his persona. You might call them the sacred, the secular, the Hebrew music, and the New York music. For the first time, all of these came together as a one.
If you ask me to love you on a bed of spice, well, that might be nice once or twice.
I believe in one God, but then I believe in 3. I'll believe in 20 gods, they'll believe in me. That's a pact, shake on that, no taking back.
God said, let there be light, and there was light.
Let there be night, and there was
God said, let there be day, and there was day.
to follow the night,
And it was good, brother.
and it was good, brother,
It was good, brother.
and it was goddamn good.
I think it's how to maintain faith honest at a time when it's so hard to have any faith at all.
I confess to Almighty God, to Blessed Mary, ever Virgin, to Blessed Michael the Archangel, to Blessed John the Baptist, to the holy apostles Peter and Paul.
He was born at a difficult time for a composer because the critics were all powerful, and the critics insisted that you write discordant music, whether people liked it or not. And that I think he could have done much better in the 19th century. But anyway, And here is his overture to Candide. You'll hear a number of melodies that may or may not be familiar, and it's conducted by Bernstein himself. Do you remember when I showed you Richard Strauss conducting? And he's like this. Bernstein was so embodied the music. It's just wonderful, I think. And in a way, Bernstein also embodies the philosophy that we can take away from Candide. I think that if you read the book, it's not a long read. You know, it's so important, it's amazing to pick up Candide and see how slender a novella, really, it's so slender. But it's so compact. His way of describing things is so vivid and so compact and often so horrible that you keep reading. And the charm of it is the secret to life, maybe for all of us. I used to think that of Beverly Sills. The secret is to take all the slings and arrows that outrageous fortune hands you and not be bitter, and still come out with your enthusiasm and your appreciation of all the glories of life that are there. And that's really the basic story of Candide. But in the process, he manages to level some pretty bitter and true accusations at the church and the monarchy and every institution you can think of. As you read it, it seems pretty ridiculous, and it is. And that's because it's meant to be a satire. If you go into this operetta, it's really considered operetta because it has dialogue. Bernstein even called it a musical comedy. If you go into it expecting some heavy philosophy, you will be disappointed because it's not meant to be taken absolutely seriously, except in that it tries to right some of the wrongs that we still have in our world. We've righted an awful lot of them, and we've gotten much, much better, but still. Candide is the nephew of the Baron Thunder von der Tronk. I think I've said it right. And there is a narrator who tells the story as they go along. You don't really need me. He grows up very happy in this best of all possible worlds with a tutor named Pangloss who keeps throughout the book sort of dying, being killed, and coming back to life again, but as do they all. I think we'll start just with the narrator telling you the story of how he and the girl's name was Cunegonde. I don't know why that didn't become popular. And I must say that I've heard Kristen Chenoweth, and I'm sure you all have. You've heard her singing pop songs, singing musical comedy, and I thought she's a beautiful girl, but has a very nasal voice. It's very nasal, but in this she sounds absolutely lovely. I think she's terrific. Let's see what you think. There have been a lot of incarnations of Candide. The first one was very heavy, very long. It was like 3 or 4 hours. And it did not have great success. The critics hated it. The audience did not flock to see it. They found it discordant and confusing. And then it was reworked together with Stephen Sondheim, which is interesting, master of the theater. And the lyrics for this were written by a committee, and the one that caught my eye was Dorothy Parker. And you will definitely hear some Dorothy Parker lines in it. So this is Dr. Pangloss telling the story, or Thomas Allen telling the story.
Syllogism number 1. Since this is the only possible world, it follows
that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Correct. Ergo, since this is the best of all possible worlds, it follows that
everything that happens in this world is for the best.
Correct. So if any man say that all is well,
he lies.
Everything is not well.
Everything is for the best in this best of all possible worlds.
Let us review lesson 11.
Paragraph 2, axiom 7.
Once one dismisses the rest of all possible worlds, one finds that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Once one dismisses the rest of all possible worlds, one finds that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Preclassify pigeons and camels.
Pigeons can fly.
Camels are mammals.
There is a reason for everything under the sun.
There is a season for everything under the sun. Objection! What about snakes?
Snakes. 'Twas snake that tempted Mother Eve. Because of snake we now believe that though depraved we can be saved from hellfire and damnation.
Because of snake's temptation.
If snake had not seduced our lot and primed us for salvation, Jehovah could not pardon all the sins that we call cardinal, involving bed and bottle.
Now unto Aristotle.
Mankind is one, all men are brothers.
As you have done, do unto others.
It's on best of all possible worlds.
All's for the good in this best of all possible worlds.
Objection! What about war?
War. Though war may seem a bloody curse, it is a blessing in reverse when cannons roar both rich and poor by danger are united.
Till every wrong is righted.
Philosophers make evident the point that I have cited. 'Tis war makes equal, as it were, the noble and the commoner. Thus war improves relations.
Now on to conjugations.
Amo, amass, amact, amamus.
Amo, amass, amact, amamus.
Proving that this is the best of all possible worlds.
With love and kisses, the best of all possible worlds.
Quodera demonstrandum.
Quodera demonstrandum.
Quodera demonstrandum.
Amamus.
Quodera demonstrandum. In this best of all possible worlds. Quodera demonstrandum. Soon, when we feel we can afford it, we'll build a modest little farm.
We'll buy a yacht and live aboard it, rolling in luxury and stylish charm.
Cows and chickens,
Social world,
peas and cabbage.
ropes of pearls.
Soon there'll be little ones beside us. We'll have a sweet Westphalian home.
Somehow we'll grow as rich as Midas. We'll live in Paris when we're not in Rome.
Smiling babies,
Marble homes,
Sunday picnics.
costume balls. Oh, let my roof of silk and satin be chic. I'll have all that I desire.
Kind girls will tutor us in Latin and Greek while we sit before the fire.
Glowing rubies,
Glowing logs,
faithful servants.
faithful dogs.
We'll roam the world enjoying high life. Oh, bubbly pink champagne and gold.
We'll lead a rustic and a shy life, feeding the pigs and sweetly growing old.
Breast of peacock,
Apple pie,
I love marriage.
so do I.
Prepare, happily, it's very rare. Hickory, prepare, happily, it's very rare. Hickory,
Oh, happy pair, oh, happily.
So he's sent out into the cruel world, and he doesn't know that behind him the Bulgarians attack the castle of Tunda von Tronk. And the Baron and his wife are killed, and Cunegonde is raped by the entire Bulgarian army. And he thinks she's dead. So he goes off to his next adventure. So he goes off to Lisbon and gets there just in time for the famous earthquake of 1755, I think it was. And he is involved, gets taken by the Inquisition, and they're going to burn him and Dr. Pangloss at the stake because they are intruders and non-believers. And they have a marvelous piece called It's a Lovely Day for the Auto da Fe. Do you think that was Dorothy Parker or what? Cunegonde has some, she didn't die, even though she had a bayonet to the heart and was raped by the entire Bulgarian army. And she is taken away to Paris. And in Paris, she meets the Grand Inquisitor, and she is purchased as a slave by a very wealthy Jew. So the Jew, unfortunately, shows off his beauty to the Grand Inquisitor, who demands a share. So they decide that the Jew has her on Monday, the Inquisitor has her on Tuesday, and they alternate, and then she has one day off. And on Saturday, one arrives at midnight. That's important to remember, because, well, that comes later in the story. But here she is in Paris, France.
victimized by bitter circumstance. Alas for me, had I remained beside my lady mother, my virtue had remained unstained until my maidenhead was gained by some grand duke or other. 'Twas not to be, ours necessity brought me to this gilded cage. Born to higher things, here I drew my wings. Singing of a sorrow nothing can assuage. Oh, and yet of course I rather like to revel. I have no strong objection to champagne. My wardrobe is expensive as the devil. Perhaps it is ignoble to complain. Enough of being basely tearful. I'll show my noble stuff by being bright and cheerful. Pearls and ruby rings. How can worldly things take the place of honor lost? Can they compensate for my fallen state, purchased as they were at such an awful cost? Bracelets, lavaliers, can they dry my tears? Can they blind my eyes to shame? Can the brightest brooch shield me from reproach? Can the purest diamond purify my name? And yet, of course, these trinkets are endearing. I know so glad my sapphire is a star. I rather like a 20-carat earring. If I'm not pure, at least my jewels are. Enough. I'll take their diamond necklace and show my noble stuff by being gay and reckless. Observe how bravely I conceal the dreadful shame I feel.
true? Cunegonde, Cunegonde, Cunegonde. Is it true? Cunegonde, oh my love, dear love. Dearest, how can this be so? You were dead, you know. You were shot and bayoneted too.
That is very true. Oh, but love will find a way.
Then what did you do?
We'll go into that another day. Now let's talk of you. You are looking very well. Weren't you clever, dear, to survive?
I've a sorry tale to tell. I escaped more dead than alive.
Fine, where did you go?
Oh, I wandered to and fro.
Oh, what torture, oh, what pain.
Holland, Portugal, and Spain.
Oh, what torture.
Holland, Portugal.
Oh, what torture.
I would do it all again. To find you at last, reunited after so much pain. But the pain is past. We are one again.
We are one at last.
One again, one at last, one again, one at last.
This is wonderful. She meets a character whom I think you all are familiar with, Patti LuPone. And she plays the role of the old lady. Now, the stock characters in Commedia dell'arte are in this. The two ingenues is Candide and Cunegonde, and the wise doctor is Dr. Pangloss. And usually the old lady is very insignificant. But I'll tell you what, when Patti LuPone plays the old lady, she is not insignificant. And later you'll see more of her, but this is enough right here. This is very charming. So Cunegonde is complaining about her fate, and the old lady tells her what has happened to her. Now, all these people remember Voltaire's secret initiative. They all came from high estates. They all were aristocrats, so you see, any of us can fall. And the old lady is one of those. She was born to have a fabulous future and fabulous life. And she was kidnapped and raped continually by a black pirate, and she came to once, and she was, there was a beautiful blonde man astride her and cursing the fact that he had been castrated. And eventually they were starving in a siege in a castle, and they had nothing whatever to eat, and so they said, we'll cut off one buttock of all the women, and they'll have plenty to eat, because then there'll be more next week too. And so she has lost one buttock, and you will hear her say that. She's telling the story, and so I'll let her tell it. You won't understand her accent, but I wanted to give you this past thing. She says, I am easily assimilated.
Buenas tardes, senors. It is your privilege to encounter the greatest courtesan from Paris, France. All one needs to enjoy her immortal favors is a princely song. I was not born in sunny Hispania. My father came from Rovno, Gubernia. But now I'm here, I'm dancing a tango. Die, di, die, di, die, di, die. I am easily assimilated. I am so easily assimilated. I never learned a human language. My father spoke a high Middle Polish. In 1/2 hour I'm talking in Spanish. Por favor, Tariador, I am easily assimilated. I am so easily assimilated. It's easy, it's ever so easy. I'm Spanish, I'm certainly Spanish. And you must be Spanish too, to like the natives do. These days you have to be in the majority.
Tus labios rubí, dos rosas que se abren a mí, conquistan mi corazón y solo con una canción.
Mis labios rubí, decir de todo crecer a mí. Oui, oui, si, si, ay, 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 es esta, je ne sais quoi.
Me muero, me sale una hernia.
A long way from Rubio Gubernio.
Ay, mamá.
Piramida.
As the governor prepares himself for conjugal bliss, the old lady and Cunegonde celebrate the triumph of their feminine charms.
None of man ever born ever could resist a well-turned calf, a slender wrist, a silhouette as airy as the morning mist, and a dainty dimpled knee.
Every male I may meet must acclaim for weeks my twinkling thighs, my flaxen cheeks, my memorable memories like alpine peaks, high above a wine dark sea.
With necks like spawn,
With necks like swan,
and sexually
and oh so sexy legs,
we're so light-footed we could dance on legs. A pair of limbs from fairyland, and every day and everywhere our tongues expand.
You may add, if you wish, to that growing list
A mouth so fair,
it must be kissed.
and what we cannot mention but we know exists in a rich abundance. Could resist a pretty little thing like me.
Baseball is a really boring sport.
It's better than soccer. It's like slow hockey or something.
No man ever born ever could resist a well-turned calf, a slender wrist, a silhouette as airy as the morning mist, and a dainty dimpled knee.
Every male I may meet must acclaim for weeks my twinkling thighs, my flaxen cheeks, my memorable memories like alpine peaks, my immortal wine dark sea.
We jumped up and
we struck a hand,
and she smiled.
When Mona Lisa smiles,
We're brava Davina to balletto files. All pair of limbs from fairyland, and every day our child fights
You may add, if you wish, to that growing list
a mouth so fair,
it must be kissed.
and perhaps we cannot mention, but we know it exists in a rich abundant sea. Never could resist a pretty little thing like me.
I thought the Jew, the Pope, the Archbishop, and the Bulgarian army treated me bad.
The Pope? Then?
Couple Saturday nights between the Sabbaths. But you!
Quiet.
Oi, 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 oi.
Quiet.
No doubt you think I'm giving in to petulance and malice, but in candor I am forced to say that I'm sick of gracious living in this stuffy little palace, and I wish that I could leave today. I have suffered a lot, and I'm certainly not unaware that this life has its black side. I have starved in the ditch, I've been bound for a beach, and I'm missing the half of my backside. I've been beaten and whipped and repeatedly stripped. I've been forced into all kinds of whoredom, but I'm finding of late that the very worst fate is to perish of comfort and boredom.
Quiet.
It was 3 years ago, as you very well know, that you said we would soon have a wedding. Every day you forget what you promised, and yet you continue to wrong for my bedding. I'll no longer bring shame on my family name. No, I'd rather lie down and be buried. No, I'll not lead the life of an unwedded wife. Tell me, when are we going to be married?
Quiet!
I was once but a small, nearly sawn in four by a specially clumsy Madeira.
that old hag is no use in this gyp joint. Not a sou have I made on her yet. And the one thing that pays in this clip joint is my fraudulent game of roulette. It's my game of roulette. But I have to pay so much protection to the chief of police and his men, that each day when he makes his collection, I'm a poor man all over again.
What's the use? What's the use of this honest endeavor and being so clever? It's wrong, oh so wrong, if you just have to pass it along.
It's a very fine thing to be prefect, shaking down all the gamblers in town. My position has only one defect, that there's someone who's shaking me down, who is shaking me down. For this fellow unhappily knows me, and he's unto the game that I play, and he threatens to shame and expose me if I do not incessantly pay.
What's the use? What's the use of this sneaky conniving and slimy contriving? It's wrong, oh so wrong, if you just have to pass it along.
I could live very well by extortion, but I simply can't keep what I earn, for I haven't a sense of proportion, and roulette is my only concern, it's my only concern. I've a system that's fiendishly clever, which I learned from a croupier friend, and I should go on winning forever, but I do seem to lose in the end.
What's the use? What's the use of this cheating and plotting? You end up with nothing. It's wrong, oh so wrong, if you just have to pass it along.
There's another hour of terrible adventures and great fun. And the finale is the moral of the story, which is that the secret of life is not to look for treasure, not to look for heaven in the afterlife, not to look with other people at all, but to cultivate your garden. And jardin, garden, it was in those days considered to be fields and fields, not just one little patio garden in the back. And they go through all these adventures, and at the end they decide, as did Voltaire, to settle down and cultivate their own little gardens. And this is the finale.
We will seek a few modest little acres and build a small farm. And casting aside all vain speculations as to the meaning of this meaningless world, we will fulfill our function, working God's earth from dawn to dusk.
Been a fool, and so have I, but come and be my wife, and let us try before we die to make some sense of life. We're neither pure nor wise nor good. We'll do the best we know. We'll build our house and chop our wood and make our garden grow, and make our garden grow.
Any questions?
Fine class, yes it is. Fine. Go and make your gardens grow.